Okay. Saharayim Tovim. Good afternoon to everyone who is on the East Coast. Boker Tov, or good morning to all of you who are on the West Coast, and Erev Tov to our friends in Israel. I'm Alicia Post. I'm the Executive Director of RZA. Thank you all for joining us for this important and timely discussion. The RZA is a movement, Religious Zionists of America, is a movement that strives to build a strong bridge between Israel and the American Jewish community, support the state of Israel, and ensure that American Jews are connected to and taking responsibility for the state of Israel and the future of the Jewish people. A few housekeeping notes for today's meeting. As you may have noticed, you are all muted. I encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A section or chat me directly, and we will try and get to as many questions as time permits. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available for viewing. We will be sure to send out a link to everyone who registered. I will now turn it over to RZA's president, Stephen Fleta in Jerusalem.
Thanks, Alicia. Quorum has finally ended in Jerusalem too. So we've had almost a normal day today. Our esteemed speaker tonight is Professor Gerald Steinberg. He is the founder and president of NGO Monitor and a professor emeritus at Bar-Ilan University, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiation. Gerald has devoted 20 years to his research on Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and NGOs, as well as Israeli politics and arms control. You can learn more about Gerald via his many publications, such as Israel Law Review, and published op-ed columns and appearances as a commentator on numerous well-known networks, including the Beeb, Al Jazeera, and NPR. You can view his full bio on ngo-monitor.org. Welcome, Gerald.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Alicia, and thank the RZA and everybody who's on this call. I see a lot of familiar names and some familiar faces, those that I can see. So it's good to see everybody. As dark as these times are, it's good to see the support, the unity.
So would you give us a little briefing and then we'll open for question and answer? A little background.
Okay, well, you mentioned that I've been working on naming and shaming or monitoring and exposing and researching non-governmental organizations with a particular and now quite obvious focus on Israel, an obsession. Demonization is a term we often use, delegitimization. So maybe I'll give you a few minutes of background as to why I started to do this, because I think it explains why these are so important. And we're seeing them exploding now. We see UNRWA, of course, and we see United Nations agencies, but working very closely and in some ways leading these organizations, the UN agencies, the various government officials in condemning and constantly demonizing Israel. What we see is, and that's what NGO Monitor has done, is that organizations that are supposed to be promoting human rights, that are known as highly respected human rights organizations, sometimes humanitarian aid organizations, are very much leading this process. I began to see that over almost 25 years ago in the work that I was doing in other realms, but I had, on occasion, I would go to Geneva, I would go to New York, I would be at UN frameworks, and I would see individuals handing out material. This was already in the late 90s, early 2000s, saying Israel was violating international law, Israel was doing terrible things, Israel needs to be condemned, needs to be brought to justice. And these, you'd see, who are these people, I began to ask. It was Human Rights Watch, it was Amnesty International. It was marginal. It wasn't something that most people see or paid attention to. It was on the sides, on the fringes of these UN meetings. They weren't really covered in most cases by journalists, by others. But then came, after around 2000, 2001, what was called the Second Intifada. I don't like to use that term. I refer to it as Arafat's war, and Israelis were being blown up and killed. Tragically, the number of casualties were going up, and Israel, when Israel fought back, when Israel took measures against this, particularly in in Jenin, in what was called Operation Offensive Shield, Israel was condemned by these organizations. I was watching BBC at the time. I don't do that anymore. But BBC, they brought in an expert from Amnesty International. And he said, yes, I can testify that Israel is committing a massacre in Jenin. This was in March of 2002. How did he know this? Nobody asked him. And then it got to be all over covered in the media. And then you began to see pressure from various governments, including from, at that time, the Bush administration in the United States, that Israel, it sounded familiar, Israel was acting disproportionately, Israel was attacking civilians. This language was already being used then. There was another event that sort of triggered me into this, and that was something called the Durban United Nations Conference on the elimination of racism. It took place in Durban, South Africa, a few months before this, in the September 2001. It was a week before 9/11. And there was an NGO forum there that I was observing. I saw them planning this, and they started to write about this. They were talking about the NGO forum. They brought together 5,000 delegates into a stadium in South Africa with one common theme. Israel was an apartheid state. Israel was committing genocide. This was in 2001. And then I began to see, I saw this as a movement, as a campaign, as what was called in the language of political science, a soft power threat. It's also the language of lawfare. That's where the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And you could see that they took all these mechanisms that were prevalent, that were used against the South African apartheid regime and the Palestinians and their allies, through these powerful organizations called non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Again, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they were the orchestra leaders of this event in Durban. And then you hear it repeated and repeated. I mentioned the Jenin massacre myth in United Nations investigations. And then you see it repeated again in after the 2008, the first Gaza war, Goldstone report, and over. So what we're seeing now is in many ways an explosion based on what we saw already 20-something years ago. So that's the background for all this work. And I think it was not given the attention that it should have gotten for most of those years. And that was a source of frustration. Now we're seeing it becoming more of a central issue, but unfortunately the costs are very high. I figure that's enough of an introduction to get us going here. I could do my whole history and spend 18 hours on it, but I don't think you want to do that.
Gerald, you have mentioned in your work that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have become superpowers. Can you elaborate on that for us?
One of the themes that I began to develop was follow the money. Right? You see that in various other places. So what makes these organizations superpowers, first of all, is their huge budgets. Just to give you a sense of it, I talk a lot about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. There are many others out there, but those are really the two biggest. Biggest in the sense of their budgets, the size of their staffs, and that buys influence. So Human Rights Watch now has a budget of around $100 million a year. Now, if you can imagine, I've had conversations with Israeli diplomats about this. How do you counter the propaganda? Imagine that the Israeli Foreign Ministry had a budget of $100 million a year. And that's just one organization. It's based in New York. Almost every time that it's quoted in the New York Times, or often by government officials, these are highly respected experts in human rights. Amnesty International is based in London. It has an annual budget of about 330, last time I checked, million euros. So add 10% to that, you're up to, you're talking about big bucks, right? 350, $360 million a year, a million here, a million there. It adds up. Oxfam has recently gotten to the act, even though they are supposed to be a humanitarian aid organization. They've been continuously publishing condemnations of Israel since October 7th. Starvation, obstructing humanitarian aid, violating international law. They have a budget of $500 million, $500 million a year. And there are many others like that. There's something called World Vision. They have a budget. Now, they don't just focus on Israel, but they have a budget of about $3 billion a year worldwide. They have considerable investment, I would say, or focus on Israel. So you add up all these things and you see this is a massive, massive framework. So that's why I use the term superpowers in respect to those, because you buy publicity. When starting right after October 7th, I try to track, NGO Monitor tries to track. It's a good thing we got 15 people working. It's a good thing they're working with us, because otherwise I'd collapse completely and my family wouldn't talk to me. But we track where these experts are appearing. And they're appearing on all the major television news programs. They're appearing, and I include in that CNN, on a regular basis, not just in the United States, certainly BBC, certainly other television frameworks in the UK, but also in Australia, in Canada, and most of Europe. So how do they get to be there? Well, they advertise themselves as experts. They have a staff of dozens of PR people who market these experts. They put out reports and social media statements and posts. Almost always, unfortunately, part of our job is to see what they say. They say the same thing day after day. Ken Roth was the head of Human Rights Watch for close to 30 years. If you follow he's the most highly respected human rights expert. Ken Roth tweets, dozens of tweets a day, and a vast number of them, I don't know necessarily a majority, but certainly a completely overdone, disproportionate, I think is a good term, obsessive number of, we don't call them tweets anymore, right? We call them posts on X, but they used to be called Twitter. Our condemnations of Israel, where he's quoting Al Jazeera or the Washington Post. I don't know if there's a difference anymore. Sometimes the New York Times. Every time there's a condemnation of Israel, Chuck Schumer was a big favorite of his, but he quotes selectively, nothing about the hostages. I'm just using that as an example. He's got 500,000 or 600,000, I think, followers. And they have a whole machine that pumps up this propaganda. Each one of these organizations, same thing for Amnesty. Exactly the same process with Amnesty. So they get their reports, their submissions to the US government, to the UN, are quoted by major media platforms constantly. I had a conversation with the New York Times correspondent a couple of years ago when Human Rights Watch put out a report, Amnesty first and Human Rights, they put out reports discovering that Israel was an apartheid state. Now, the report is garbage. You read it and they're quoting themselves and they're quoting all sorts of other people who have no knowledge of what's going on. And a lot of the details they get are wrong, but they're quoting stuff, long reports. And New York Times guy makes it into an article. He says, well, they're an important organization. We have to cover them. Now, the way they work, and I'll finish answering the question because it all has to do with superpowers. You have to also see how these organizations work. They will put out a report, and I use that in quotation marks if I was writing, and it might have 50 pages, 100 pages, it might have 200 footnotes or 600 footnotes, and they send embargoed copies a few days before to their favorite journalists. Now, I don't think that the Jewish, whatever it is, the Jewish Press or Times of Israel or the Jerusalem Post or Tablet would be on that list. But who is on that list? Oh, they're buddies. The ones that journalists who they know will get favorable coverage. Sorry?
What's an embargo?
They send the report. They send the report and they say, this is not to be published. We're going to release this publicly at midnight on March 30th. Random date. Okay, whatever date they just did it. But we're going to give you a copy a few days earlier so that you will write about this as a scoop, as a headline. I can't see that report in order to tell the journalist what's wrong with it. I don't get a copy of it. The Israeli Foreign Ministry doesn't get a copy of it. The Israeli government doesn't get a copy of it. All sorts of accusations of all human rights violations and international law. That's the game. The embargoed report So then what they do, what the journalists tend to do, most of them, they don't read the report. They basically put into their article the press release. This is what you're supposed to write. And 2 minutes after midnight or an hour after midnight, it goes online, it gets to the, and then we got to start looking at this thing to take it apart. And if we're really quick, we can find 10 mistakes in a couple of hours. 3 days later, we can find 100 mistakes or 100 false claims or 100. Let's look at the footnotes and find out they're quoting UNRWA, that's quoting UNICEF, that's quoting the World Food Program, that's quoting eyewitnesses in Gaza who don't anonymous eyewitness. It's just all, there's nothing substantive there. And this is all, of course, all these are international law violations, which they invent and declare. We've decided these are violations of international law. That's a very well-oiled machine, a PR machine, a propaganda machine. And they're capable of doing that because they have all this money and they've been doing it for 20 years. And every time it's the same. Okay, that's again, all my answers are long. I'll try to make them shorter.
The Jewish world, of course, runs off the Rothschilds' money. We know that as a fact. Obviously, we're told that every day. Who's financing? What individuals are financing HRW and Amnesty International? Do you know?
Some of it is public and some of it is secret. Let me start with the leaks of the secret stuff. A Saudi billionaire, he only gave about $500,000 as far as we know. They have published records and they have various accounts where there's no record. And one of the problems, by the way, is that they have a board of directors who seem to exert absolutely no oversight. A couple of months ago, the organization Memory, Yigal Carmon published a leak, a whole bunch of leaks from Qatar. One of them was a letter from Qatar official pledging $3 million, 2018, to Human Rights Watch. Additional funding. This was a leak. How much more they got if it's additional funding? And so that's one set of sources that what we don't know, but I suspect is quite large. Look, there's another major source, various foundations. Sometimes they get smart, but some of them stay on. George Soros, the Open Society Foundation, or maybe it's called Institute now, when the original donors and founders of Human Rights Watch decided to pull the plug, and the founder, Robert Bernstein, published an article, an op-ed in the New York Times in 2009, condemning the organization for turning Israel to a pariah state and losing its moral compass. So they almost folded. And then George Soros comes in with 100 million, sorry. Did they use checks and maybe checks or donation in those days? And of course, that brings in other donors. So then they're also, it's hard to tell how much the financial records don't go into that level of detail, which is a problem. But they hold these very fancy galas. You're from, those of you who are from New York know about the gala at the Met. These are galas, fundraising galas every year. They hold them in about a dozen cities. These are very, very prestigious events because it's helping human rights. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, Toronto, New York, Boston, I think also various other cities, Sydney, Australia, Berlin is a big source. It appears that they make quite a bit of money off of those. A lot of ads are taken out of the process, but it's very, very large in terms of the income. So they have a well-oiled fundraising machine, and that's also very significant there. So there's not one single source, but they're very good. And I'd say Ken Roth's greatest achievement was as a fundraiser, including from corrupt Saudi billionaires, from Qatar, and who knows from who else.
The UN obviously is a problem. Do these NGOs work hand in hand with the UN, or are they simply a source of information? Are they more like partners or as independent entities focusing on Israel?
I should just give you a one-word answer, and that is partners, but I'm going to go a little bit farther than this. Tell a story. They're definitely close partners. NGO Monitor, for all sorts of reasons, managed to become what's called a ECOSOC registered part of the United Nations system. So we're able to go and speak for 90 seconds, sometimes a bit longer, at the Human Rights Council meeting. So one of my colleagues, our legal advisor and our UN representative, Ann Hertzberg, is there now for the meeting of the Human Rights Council. I go there occasionally. And what you see there is these organizations, the Human Rights Watch representative, the Amnesty representative, the representative from something called the Federation of Human Rights, FIDH, it's in French, based in Paris, International Federation of Human Rights based in Paris. And a dozen, 24, sometimes 100 different representatives organizations that also have that same ECOSOC representation. They're not there speaking for 90 seconds. They're sitting there and writing resolutions that are then used by the heads of the Human Rights Council, by the special representatives. Francesca Albanese is the current one. People who are chosen for their particularly virulent example of anti-Semitism and history. And they work hand in hand together. There's a very close relationship. They speak, they hand out material, they write texts. I don't think that in my view, the Human Rights Council would not be as virulently anti-Israel if it wasn't for that close relationship with the organizations that have this budget, staff members and others, and this commitment, that's part of it, to demonize Israel as the flagship of 21st century human rights. And it's deeply embedded in these organizations.
Now, as we mentioned in the topic for you tonight or today, you've accused the human rights organizations of weaponizing moral principles and using them to promote anti-Semitism. How does that fit into this wave of what I can only call Jew hatred that we're seeing now? I don't like the term anti-Semitism. I don't use it in my own writings any longer. It's just out there.
Yeah, I'm also, first take off the hyphen, and now Jew hatred is a much more accurate term. I'm going to do a little academic stuff, right? I'm going to back up a little bit and do a little bit of history. I know my answers are too long. I'm going to try to make it shorter. But I got to do some history, and I'm just going to start in 1945, 48, right after the Shoah. The United Nations, Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, led a committee that drafted two documents. One is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the other one is the Convention Against Genocide. Both specifically originated out of the Shoah. There's a long history, there's some good histories detailing arguments. It was also during the Cold War period, so they had to satisfy the Americans, the Soviets, others. But they came up with a document, two documents, that were adopted by the United Nations in 1948, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. And then they set up some institutions to implement those principles. And those institutions included what's now called the Human Rights Council, had a slightly different name. And that evolved. They also used to have discussions in the UN about the elimination of racism. They had various conventions that went a little bit further. And a lot of that also involved the Cold War conflict and debate that took place. Every time, this is now we're talking about the 50s, early 60s, every time an American representative, an Israeli representative raised the issue of Soviet Jewry, and they were, as you may recall, very active on that issue, the Russians, the Soviets, would say, well, Israel is a racist state. This was already in the 50s and 60s. The anti-Semitism, or Jew hatred, we'll use anti-Semitism historically, of Stalin, all the show trials, the doctor trials, that was merged into this together in the 50s. The Arabs ate it up. The Arab League became a close partner, and this became a facet of the United Nations every year. moving forward. Now, you know where that leads to? It leads to the 1975 UN General Assembly resolution calling Zionism a form of racism. Apartheid racism that all was mixed up together and got adopted. And then there was a committee that was set up to implement that resolution with a budget, a significant budget. And of course, that budget went to, in particular, NGO officials to go and talk about the terrible things that the Zionists did. So we have this background. And then I'm going to add another element to this that was called, in academic jargon, post-colonialism. And that also has that's picked up from the Soviet propaganda and become very much more widespread. Who's guilty? It's now a form of wokeism, but we didn't use that term when I was a student in the late 60s and 70s at Berkeley after the 67 war. But colonialism, who's responsible for colonialism? The West. You know, nobody ever talks about Muslim Arab colonialism or Chinese colonialism. Why is it that countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, all that these are Muslim countries where there's a lot of also Jew hatred. I'll put that on the side. The West is guilty of colonialism. The West destroyed 2/3 of the world. And now Israel, after 67, is a colonialist power, the worst in the world, as West Bank is Judea and Samaria is colonized. We hear that a lot. It's all part of the same package. So, and I see that in the language that's used continuously by people like Ken Roth, by almost everybody that's part of the Human Rights Watch framework or Amnesty International. You pick up, and it doesn't have to just be about Israel. It's the condemnation of the United States back when Saddam Hussein was tried and executed. It was done by the Iraqi government, but the United States was behind it, according to this view. That's a form of colonial. They didn't give him a fair trial. That's what really bothered Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. And there are many, many other. And every time that Israel neutralizes, I think is the term we use, or kills a terrorist, particularly now Hamas terrorist, that's called an assassination and another example of colonialism. So you merge these streams together and you see gradually how Israel, there are other factors as well. There's traditional Christian anti-Semitism in a lot of the Christian organizations of the left ideology, liberation theology. Christian Aid in Britain is very big on this, but there are German groups as well throughout Europe. Norwegian Church Age, I can go through the list, but it's not worth it. They're all basically in that same list. And there you hear a lot of, more than echoes, particularly now, of standard Christian theology. So you put all these things together and you see this evolution of how the principles of human rights that were developed in the 1948 based on the Shoah, as a response to the Shoah, the never again theme, have been twisted and weaponized as a weapon against the Jewish people in Israel.
So as individuals, what can we do?
Well, I think that the first principle is to be active and aware and where you can respond. When you see or you hear, I'm not saying you should get into a fight with your neighbors, but you see in the media this kind of language. And my speech, and the only thing that we really do is we do NGOs, because there's some really good organizations that deal with the United Nations and UNRWA. We work closely with them, with UN Watch and Hillel Neuer and Bayevsky and her organization. There are many groups like that. And then there's Camera. I won't go through. I'm giving a plug because we all work together. Camera and Honest Reporting in the media realm. But whenever they use an NGO as a source, highly respected, as an excuse, as a justification for a denunciation of Israel, It's something you can react to, individuals can react to. When speakers are brought into various frameworks, it's getting harder and harder, because it used to be, at least I would say to academics, and they should still do it. When a law school brings in a speaker, has an event where I did the main groups, the main visible superpowers, as we talked about, but there are hundreds of these groups. Our NGO Monitor tracks 250. And some of them are connected directly to the PFLP, Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine, terrorist organization that was involved also on October 7th. They're considered to be human rights organizations. And so when they're quoted as experts, you can certainly consult with us, look up on our website, which is very accessible, easily looked at. Who are they quoting? Are these, in fact, experts, or are they Jew haters, propagandists? So I think that's one very important aspect of this, that everybody can participate. And then each person in his own or her own area of activity, connected to senators, members of Congress. Why are you, or report that your committee does, mostly now going to be Democrats, Republicans don't generally quote NGOs. Why are you giving them the authority, the legitimacy as experts on all of these things? That message needs to be repeated over and over again.
The question of condemnations that we see at the UN. I mean, obviously, it's Israel's violations of human rights seem to be the only standing agenda item on the UN Council of Human Rights. Do these NGOs, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, do they complain about anybody else?
Well, the simple answer is yes, and they'll always tell you, well, we have hundreds of reports. We do China, we do other countries. On Iran, they're kind of quiet. They do maybe one report every few years on Syria. Well, these countries are not considered to be, they're not American allies. They're not considered to be upstanding citizens, unlike what Israel was supposed to be back. They'll give you lines like that. We are holding Israel to a higher standard, is what Ken Roth used to say and occasionally does say. I mean, who are you, Ken Roth, who is a documented Israel hater and occasionally blatantly anti-Semitic in some of your posts? Who are you to hold anybody to a higher standard? We've done some research. We have to redo it again, but you'd see, if you count the number of pages or posts on social media in a certain period of time, a week, a month, whatever, you usually see that Israel is the dominant one, sometimes half, sometimes even more than half of all the verbiage that an NGO puts out is about Israel. And that's where the UN just copies that. Now, in the UN and the Human Rights Council, because China's a member, they can't condemn China, because the Chinese will veto that. Will say, no, you can't do that. I just want to add a side comment here. The Human Rights Council, where a lot of this action takes place, very highly respected, and you see that they're quoted all over the place by journalists and others, diplomats. Well, the majority of countries, they're divided up into 5 regional groups. 3 of them are dominated by Muslim countries. Everything the UN does, particularly the Human Rights Council, the bloc called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has 55 members plus the Palestinians, so sometimes they'll count them as 56, and the largest bloc in the UN. They control almost everything that happens in the Human Rights Council. So of course, a large proportion, the only really significant thing they do in their meetings is to decide how to attack Israel, again, in a different, slightly different form. The United States is a member, by the way, of the Human Rights Council, because President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken decided that that was an important place to have influence. And I asked them, I asked members of Congress occasionally, what have you accomplished by being members of this farce? Well, it would be worse, they say. Oh, I don't think it would be worse, because it legitimizes this whole machine. It's an industry which incorporates the NGOs. A lot of the people in the UN process are either former NGO employees of these same organizations or very closely connected to them. So again, it comes back to that same theme. So I think we have to really emphasize that point.
Can you comment at all? This may be an unfair question, Gerald. We've been focusing a lot on UNRWA since the war in Gaza. And we know it's a special entity that was set up to handle the Palestinians, and yet the United Nations Committee for what do they call it? The High Commissioner for Refugees has been functioning since the late 1940s as well. Can you explain the dichotomy? Why they're not one entity?
The entire purpose, not just my view, of creating UNRWA in 1949 was to perpetuate the Palestinian narrative, myth, campaign to reverse the creation of the State of Israel and the outcome of the War of Independence. That's what we're seeing now. Every poll, I don't think the polls of Palestinians are necessarily very reliable, but if you look at everything Palestinian society, this is not about a few bad apples. This is Palestinian society. Want to go back, don't want to recognize Israel, don't want to reach, there's no two-state solution on their agenda. And UNRWA is the best vehicle for that. They're refugees. They're victims of the Zionists, the terrible Zionists. So they're closely built in together. The resolution creating UNRWA was adopted by the UN because they were suffering, they were refugees, and because the Arabs all supported it in 1949. And today you can't get a majority to create UNRWA, to end UNRWA, to change that resolution. The only alternative is to cut their budget. And I have to say, with all the criticism of the Biden administration, as of now, they are maintaining with congressional pressure, particularly from the House, no money to UNRWA till at least 2025. The U.S. is the largest single donor to UNRWA of all the absurdities. So that is a significant move as long as they maintain that position. So UNRWA was created for that purpose. I think they have 30,000 employees, a large number of them in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, in schools, teachers. And all the food programs, the refugee camps. Why do they need refugee camps 76 years after the war ended? In order to perpetuate the Palestinian goal and mythology of being victims. So not only does UNRWA cooperate closely, and members of Hamas are very active. I think the Wall Street Journal estimate, I think Israeli intelligence estimates something like 15%, it's probably higher, of UNRWA staff are Hamas members, plus there's also PFLP and other groups. The 200 or so Western or non-Western, non-Palestinian staff members of UNRWA are totally bought in to the same mission, plus they get the big salaries. It's a huge amount of money they control. I think 1.5 billion currently. You don't give that up easily. That's a huge patronage option and a lot of corruption, but doesn't seem to change anybody's opinion.
Francesca Albanese, you mentioned her name before. What's her problem?
Well, she was chosen for this job precisely because of her history. This is of Jew hatred. Her posts before a long number of years ago in Italian, got good Italian people showing us to this, which are the Jews control, I don't remember, the banks, the media, whatever it was. This is not Israel anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. This is classic left-wing communist / Catholic. I'll leave that to others to, it doesn't seem to go together, but in fact, in a number of countries in Europe and other places, they do go together. This is classical anti-Semitism. All those factors merge together. She was a great choice for this position. And before her, there were people like John Dugard and Michael Link and Richard Falk. I wrote a book review of their histories that they put out. that Albanese wrote the preface introduction to. They're all cut from the same mold. The special rapporteur for Palestinians or occupied territory, whatever the language is there, are precisely chosen for this job, for this position. And there's no busha, there's no shame, there's no embarrassment in the UN system. And that's something that, again, I come back to the argument the United States should not be participating in this, should not be a member of the Human Rights Council or pay any money towards it to make sure that no US funding, they should set an example, goes to the Human Rights Council.
I remember reading a few years ago that there were certain European countries that are assisting NGOs in their criticism of Israel. Is that still happening?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that, and I should have, so it's a good thing you're asking me about that.
So talk about it.
We talked about the superpowers, but then there's the second tier, which is there are about 50 of them are Palestinian NGOs, maybe 20 or 30 European-based, mainly church-based NGOs, all under the framework of human rights, sometimes humanitarian aid, moral principles, democracy. As I said, NGO Monitor tracks 250 organizations. So unlike Human Rights Watch, which does not, to the extent that we can tell, get any government funding except for Qatar and Arab countries, but they don't get European funding. Europe roughly provides about $100 million a year to another group of about 50 or 60 active NGOs that do the same thing. They appear at the UN, they influence journalists, they write reports. Some of these are Israeli. And some of you may have seen recently, if you look, I'm saying this, and don't laugh, Haaretz ran a piece about an internal huge conflict inside B'Tselem, which is one of the favorites of the European governments, over their response to October 7th. And a couple of people in B'Tselem have the backbone of saying, what we're doing and calling for an immediate ceasefire and talking about Israeli apartheid today is immoral, not human rights. And they were slapped down and fired by the heads of B'Tselem. But that money all comes from Europe, the Palestinian groups, which are closely tied to the terror framework. We've identified about 13 of them. The Israeli government has labeled 8 of them as terror fronts under the label of human rights. A couple of European governments have finally stopped the funding. That's one of the things we're most proud of having accomplished. Germany pulled off, they pulled the plug. Big fight going on. These are our friends. I call them subcontractors. They were involved in anti-Jewish hate after October 7th. We're going to cut them off. That's impressive. Germany did that. The Swiss cut off funding for the 6 that they funded. That was a surprise, and that took a lot of backbone. There's a big pushback. You look at some of the Swiss newspapers, you'll see articles about NGO Monitor. Italy, we haven't confirmed this yet, but an Italian newspaper on the left attacked NGO Monitor for causing Italy to stop the funding of 4 or 5 million euros a year to the same group of NGOs. That's all part of the propaganda machine. So slowly and gradually, that is being exposed, and it's harder and harder for European politicians, with the exception of the real haters, Ireland, Spain, a few others, Belgium. The rest of them are having more and more difficulty justifying large amounts of money, 5, 10 million euros a year, going to this network. It's really a network. They all work together, and they reinforce Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. And I mentioned the FIDH in Paris, which is the French always have to have a French-speaking version of what happens in English. FIDH is the French version of Amnesty International. Just as virulent or even more, with a lot of French government funding, one of the questions is, and members of parliament are finally asking, why do we give them money, taxpayer money? That's important.
You've used the term lawfare. Well, so have I. In fact, people raised eyebrows when I sued the Islamic Republic of Iran for its role in the murder of my daughter, Elisa. And that was one family going after a sovereign country, not sovereign, but definitely not worthy of the title country. And now we seem that Israel is on the receiving end of court cases. This travesty in was it The Hague or in Europe or wherever, Geneva, wherever.
It was The Hague.
In The Hague. Where is this all heading? Where is this concept of using the courts for, I guess, political purposes, which is what I was accused of? Is it going to end?
No, it's a very successful form of demonizing and delegitimizing Israel. The International Court of Justice, responding to a South African complaint where there were so many citations from the same NGOs, or citations to the United Nations which cited the NGOs, South Africa went to The Hague and said, we accuse Israel of genocide. And it's not really a court, it's a kangaroo court. The justices are political. They're chosen for political purposes by the governments. So you have an Egyptian judge. The head of the International Criminal Court now is from Lebanon.
Yeah.
You think the Lebanese government would have appointed, that means Hezbollah, would have appointed the Chief Justice of the International Court of Justice if he wasn't part of the whole industry? So lawfare is and the NGOs were pioneers in this. It came up in Durban and back in the Durban conference in 2001. Israel violates international law. They twisted international law completely beyond recognition. I got to say this, and if there are lawyers on this and they want to argue with me, that's fine. But in my view, international humanitarian law, IHL, meaning the law of warfare, sometimes called law of armed conflict, is entirely bogus law. It's not really law. The courts are not really courts. There is no due process. They are not democratically accountable because it's basically a United Nations body of 190, 92 countries, the vast majority of which are not even democratic. So how can they be accountable to anybody? But they have big budgets. The International Criminal Court was set up. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty had a major role in promoting the propaganda that led to the creation of the International Criminal Court as the solution to the horrors of war. And what's their major focus now? Let's go after Israel. Genocide, colonialism, illegal occupation. You'll see all of that. It's a very, very lucrative in terms of getting visibility, publicity, getting money to do this. We talked about money. So some of this is funded by European governments, a lot of it under the facade of human rights. There's a group also specifically in a number of countries, there are their own superpowers. So there's something in Norway called the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is headed by a gentleman by the name of Jan, Jan Ingeland. He, like others, like Ken Roth, he's got this obsession with Israel. Maybe it's because it's Jews with a backbone who fight back to defend themselves. Maybe it's because of the suffering of the Palestinians, whatever it is. They've got a tens of millions of dollar budget from, this is the Norwegian Refugee Council. You'd think, okay, the Norwegian government supports them, which they do. The British government gives them something like £3 million a year. This is a conservative British government. And they operate in secret. We know that they give money to other NGOs, but that's top secret. Taxpayer money from the European Union, from the British government, from other governments, the Norwegian government. Again, I can go on and on about this. It's a huge industry. And the more you uncover, it's like archaeology. You go dig deeper and you get down 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000, 3,000 years. There's no end. So all these things are tied together. And lawfare, I started to talk about Norwegian Refugee Council because they fund lawfare in many different formats.
You mentioned B'Tselem before. And frankly, I haven't thought about them in a long while. I guess because I read the Jerusalem Post, they don't get a lot of coverage in Jerusalem Post. Are they being, I don't want to use the word partners, but are they partners with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International?
Absolutely.
They're getting funds from them too?
No, not to the extent that we know. They don't need to. They get money from European governments. more than half. Some of these organizations get 90, even 100% from European governments. It's a network. The 25 Israeli groups in this network, they all work together. Sometimes the head of one group will go to another group, and then number two will go to the other place. It's a revolving door. They all get funded by European governments, basically in the same format, and it's a constant. It's a sort of a shell game in that sense, and unless somebody from the inside decides they've had enough, as in the case of a couple of people since October 7th, they continue. They are a fig leaf. Oh, we're not anti-Israel. We're not anti-Jewish. We're not anti-Semitic. That's their language. Because B'Tselem agrees with us. The first major report in the current wave on Israel as an apartheid state came out from B'Tselem. And then floodgates opened. Then it was okay. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they all followed. They're very proud of that, the heads of B'Tselem. Now, you can do psychological angle, you can all sorts of analyses, which that's fine, except that I have no way of demonstrating it. The money comes primarily from European governments. And when you ask the Europeans, first of all, that most of the time, the ministers who sign the checks have no idea what they're signing. I sign, he says, a budget of 10, 20, $100 million, depending on the country, for human rights. We have different regional directors and sub-directors, and they formulate what the best place is to provide the money. Almost no country holds parliamentary hearings like Congress does. And the United States is the least bad example of oversight and due diligence. There, the US funding is public, and sometimes they do fund money that goes to terrorists. And then we go to Congress, and Congress says, wait a minute, call USAID. And in most cases, the funding ends before the next funding round. They don't stop it right away usually, but before the next funding round. The Europeans don't do any of this. These are their best buddies. I got to tell you a story because it shows you how the things are connected. There's a woman called Sigrid Kaag in the Netherlands. She was the Minister of International Development and Cooperation a few years ago. She's married to one of Arafat's best buddies, Palestinian diplomat. He was the ambassador maybe to the Netherlands at some point. All right. She was a minister in the Dutch government. When the head of operations of the United Nations Organization for whatever it's called, Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, almost as bad as UNRWA, but not in the same, not specific for Palestinians, but if you read their press releases and reports, Israel is all just responsible for terrible things, and hostages, maybe they'll get 2 words, and oh yeah, and by the way, they're still hostages. So she was denied a renewed visa for Israel. The Israeli government finally said, we're not going to let these propagandists continue to have the visas that they get in order to attack Israel. She was replaced by Sigrid Kaag, that same woman from the Netherlands, who obviously wants to have a career in the United Nations, and now that she's through as a politician in the Dutch government for a while. So that's just one of many examples how close, and she's the one who signed all the checks for all the NGOs as a minister. She is an example. She actually knew who she was giving money to. So it shows you how closely connected this whole network in industry is, and it's really a corrupt industry.
Last question for you. When I was a young lad in the 1950s, the United Nations was held out to us as the savior of mankind. Today, the question I have is the UN doomed, or can it be reformed?
I don't think you'll be surprised when I answer that. In my personal view, it's beyond reform. By its very nature, of 190, I think 2 countries, of which perhaps 2/3 at least are not democratic, and where the big blocs are the Islamic bloc, and you got the Chinese and you got the Russians, used to have a Soviet bloc that doesn't exist anymore, and the Europeans are essentially, at best, they abstain, they're neutral between good and evil, between terrorists and Israel, the whole thing. There's still this halo effect of NGOs in the UN, that these are great organizations. What you saw in the 1950s in Canada is still a religion. In most parts of Europe, it's still a religion. Oh, the UN. So I don't think, as long as you have that religion, you can't reform it. So I'd rather see responsible governments, starting with the US, saying, okay, we're out of this. And not saying somehow we can reform and work in the system. But that's not going to be an easy sell to anybody.
Gerald, thank you so much. To folks on the call with us, please check our website at rza.org. And if you have any questions, you can always email office@rza.org. Let me close by saying that we continue to pray for the release of all the hostages and their safe return home. Last week in the Mizrachi world, we learned the horrible news of the death of Daniel Perez, son of Rav Doron and Shelley Perez. Rav Doron, as you may know, is the Director General of World Mizrachi. We wish the Perez family min hashamayim tenachamu at this terrible time for them. We'll continue to bring more programs like this, and in the meantime, besorer tovot, lehitraot. Everyone be well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I mean.